When civil disturbances erupted 7 years later in the wake of the Rodney King verdict, the image came back again. The hundreds of boys that I'd observed, dozens of which I talked with at length at LA County's juvenile halls, Sylmar, and then the large one downtown, those boys were now young adults during the riots. It was 7 years after I'd been there. And I figured that many, if not most of those being scooped up in the widespread arrests during the civil disturbance were largely drawn from the same pool of young males I'd seen a few short years before. And in fact, I think that was true. I remember the deputy city attorney of Los Angeles saying that these were bad guys taking advantage of a situation, and in fact 40% were on parole and 60%, I believe it was, had criminal records. Well, what he didn't say, if he'd gone down any street in Los Angeles and picked a black face or a brown face at random, 40% would have had criminal records, and 60% would have had criminal records, and 40% would have been on parole. And the criminal records could be for almost anything. I had, I didn't have the time to research it, but it was very clearly, I think my hunch was well informed. I did know that the year preceding the riots, 1/3 of all young black men between 18 and 35 living in LA County had been jailed at least once, 1/3. The exact same percentage was true in Chicago that year. It was a study done by NCCD at the time. The system was once again doing its work only too well. I wasn't the only one having this strange fantasy that we had a system that was producing that which it claimed to treat. Elizabeth Shore, Daniel Shore's wife, who's a social work writer and at Harvard, wrote a book just a few years back in which she quoted the observation of the National Commission on Children that if the nation had deliberately designed a system that would frustrate the professionals who staff it, anger the public who finance it, and abandon the children who depend on it, it could have not have done a better job than the present child welfare system. I think the question is, why do such ineffective agencies, why are they allowed to trundle on, whether or not they work at their stated task? It suggests that there's a failure that is somehow valued by the society, that indeed we value failure in juvenile corrections. It suggests that in some way, if we talk about a new program that has lower recidivism statistics or a community program does this or that, it's almost all beside the point. And in practice, it is all beside the point. I can't think of anywhere where our system has changed because of a recidivism study or because they've shown that it does. They go on, and they're treasured for the fact they produce a certain amount of it. The clientele of juvenile justice are immersed in a Harry Potter-like world, or perhaps a medieval morality play, where issues of right and wrong, power and weakness, greed and largesse, pain and suffering, compassion and retribution are paraded daily before the bench and before the public. Any envisioned reforms, therefore, and this certainly is my experience, any reforms you plan to make has to leave this drama untouched. You dare not question any of those premises. And that's the dilemma. It's a stark world of contrast in which subtlety has little salience. In this sense, it is much in tune with an electronic media desperately seeking ratings. From this horrendous thing to that horrendous thing to this to that. And then you build policy around those extreme cases, and certainly the lawyers in the room know how deleterious it is to law to build it on extreme cases. The problem for those in charge of these systems then becomes one of how to contain the reform impulse sufficiently to protect the basic myths that sustain the system. If you're going to go about any reform, do not touch these. Simple things, like, for example, when I was in Massachusetts, I always referred to the kids in our system as kids. Oh my God, the amount of hate mail and phone calls and what have you that you call them kids. They are not kids, they are thugs, they are delinquents, they are this. To even begin to question that. Now you can say, I want to reform these thugs, okay, and I'm going to set up something to reform these psychopaths, or we've got this program to recondition predatory delinquents, or what. You can do that. But if you try to at all move them out of these categories that fit the morality plays, if you try to talk about history, for example, history in reform, a history of an individual is it's forbidden for confidentiality reasons, but it's not forbidden if a prosecutor wants to bring in the record. He can bring in the record of all the things they've done or the offenses they may have been charged with or convicted of. I've had being that they do that, my response has always been that if you're going to do that, let's throw the door wide open and let's show which kids were thrown out of child welfare and how many foster homes they'd been in and who neglected this and what agency missed the boat on that and what kind of therapy did they have and who gave it and what happened and what's the story of their family and their life. I mean, if we're going to betray confidentiality in a one-sided way, well, let's betray it all the way. And maybe in a democracy, people would respond sensitively and decently to it. But because juvenile justice reforms have to make room for the political, mythological tasks that go well beyond addressing issues of preventing juvenile crime. And for that reason, studies like recidivism studies, which we all hope, I think in vain, would have some effect, they carry virtually no salience in the field.